Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for all being here. I'm Tenzin Choedon from Zubaan. I will be moderating today's conversation, which is on what food refuses to forget, the gendered label that goes beyond remembering what homes feel like. Before we begin, I just wanted to briefly share about how this panel came about. It actually grows out of one of our program, which is Culinary Lab Fellowship, which is in collaboration with Royal Enfield Social Mission. When we first began sort of designing this fellowship, we weren't only interested in documenting recipes or learning about new cuisine, but we wanted to ask different question like what can a food tell about a place and its people. And when we had this question, um, we immediately got uh, the idea of starting from Eastern Himalaya because we wanted to begin from where a region that we are familiar with, because Zubaan has a decade-long relation in the Eastern Himalaya, working there and also in the Northeast region. So we wanted to start from somewhere we are familiar with. And Eastern Himalaya being also known for, um, you know, incredible rich in history, and there are a lot to talk about migration, um, diverse communities trying to coexist together. So, but not just that, also because it's also a region that has always been at the margin, when it comes to mainstream conversation. So we wanted to bring that out and bring it to the mainland and mainstream conversation. And food being one of our favorite topic at office also, and you know years of working on fellowship, we felt food is an extremely important theme and entry point if you want to start documenting stories of a region, um, which is why this program or this fellowship sits perfectly at the intersection of, gender, memory, ecology, um, you know, sense of belongingness, and when you talk about your identity also. Even in general, when we just sit on a table across a stranger, say, um, it takes only one dish, it takes only one dish or smell of that dish for you to, naturally open a conversation. Just one bite, and then you start knowing about the other person, because then you will start talking about which community they belong to, what kind of food they consume, or like what is that one taste that sort of remember or like take them back to their home. Which is why today we have like three amazing panelists who are like three fellows from the fellowship. We have Nomika Tamang, Jigdol, Bhutia, and Pema Yangden, Lepcha. Over the past few months, they have been spending time in different places, whether it's the kitchen, homes, or streets for that matter, to document different stories in different format. And that those stories that might disappear any time, any moment. So we welcome all three of you. And I'd like to begin with a question, a very simple question, which is that, as you know, our title is What Food Refuses to Forget, right? And over the past year, when you were working on ground with your own community, listening to stories, asking questions, looking back on that journey, what do you think food actually refuses to forget? And was there a moment when you realized your project was no longer just about food? Maybe we'll start with Nomika.
Yes. Okay. So, hi, my name is Nomika and I am from Darjeeling. And through the Zubaan Culinary Lab Fellowship, I have been working on an illustrated essay that follows everyday food in Darjeeling and also explores questions of care, memory, and then the often unnoticed labor that goes behind ordinary meals. Um, to answer the question, I don't think food refuses to forget one single thing. But then, if I am to choose, I think I would say part relationships, because when I first began this project, I thought I was just asking a simple question, right? Like, what do people in Darjeeling eat every day? But then the more people I spoke to, the more I realized that food would always lead to people, and even people, they rarely answered my questions by talking about food. So every time I would ask somebody like what their favorite food was, they would like start talking about their parents, their mothers, and the persons who make the food. And then every time I would ask somebody like what food they would miss if they ever left Darjeeling, they would start talking about their childhood and then their friends. So, even when talking about recipes, I think our conversations would always lead somewhere else. Sometimes it would lead towards grief, memory, migration, even. So, in a way, I was like not documenting just food, but then I was also documenting people and their relationships through food. So, food was like the doorway. And then I think so that's why I think food refuses to forget our relationships. And beside relationships, I think it also refuses to forget care, because a meal exists because somebody prepared it, right? And then food also refuses to forget labor,
Mm-hmm.
no matter how largely unnoticed it is, especially women's labor, because that is so expected and it is also like treated as ordinary, right?
Mm.
And then when it comes to Darjeeling, I think food also refuses to forget movement, because Darjeeling has always been shaped by migration. People have traveled and recipes have traveled, and the recipes have changed over time, and then they have like become a part of our daily lives here. So I
Mm.
think food also refuses to forget those histories of migration, movement, and exchange. So that's that. I think Jigdol can add more to it now.
Thank you.
Should I just start? Is that okay?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Please go ahead.
Yeah, true to what Nomika already said. Like, of course, there are a lot of things that come into play when we talk about food. This labor, this relationships, and there are a lot of things. But yes, it is true that when I first started with the project, I kept on coming back to the food itself. I wanted to know about the history of momo, the particular type of recipes or the ingredients that were used by the women who were working in these eateries.
Yeah.
But then, as I like visited them again and again, and as we sat down to talk, what happened was like those interviews, or how I might put it, they kept on being interrupted by a lot of things, right? Sometimes a customer might just come in and ask for food, or sometimes they might have a child at home or a kid at home who needs to be looked after. They might have parents who are maybe not feeling well and they have to look after them as well. There are also people, their own relatives, friends, and who would just come in around in between work. And I think that is when this shift happened, wherein I felt that I was not just looking at Momo and how Momo was being made and what is the recipe for that specific Momo, but the routine that makes up the whole thing, right?
Mm.
And of course, as Nomika has already put in, like relationships, of course, have a large function to it. Of course, there are obligations that the women who are working in that commercial space have for themselves as well. And of course, the other thing is that the space that is commercial and the personal or the household space itself, they are not quite separate. So
Mm.
they have to juggle that as well. So I think for my projects, especially, like of course there are other things that can be taken into like factored. They can be factored into what food refuses to forget. But I think the routine and the labor that people, even though it might be a hectic routine, they might be very busy, but the amount of time that they put into making that food and the type of labor, of course, because sometimes what happens is that when you think of a eatery, the only work that comes to mind is, of course, yeah, you need to cook, right? But again, that cooking itself is intertwined with a lot of personal work, household work,
Right.
and of course, societal and community obligations as well. So I think that is the one thing that kept on coming back when I was talking to these women, when I was talking to other people in their lives as well. The labor, the routine, and the intertwining of these routine kept on coming back. Like, so I think for me, that is the one thing that uh, food refuses to forget. I think Pema Yangden now can add more to this. On to you, Pema.
Yeah, so cool. Yeah, both of you. You have said so many things. Like, I think we can all relate to that. So for me, like, I think this project has been very personal. Going back to my home, doing the project, talking to the women there, I think was like this project outcome was very personal for me. Through this project, like initially when I started, we were just planning to document the recipe, the food that our parents or our like forefather used to eat, bring that those like forgotten recipes and all back. But then gradually when we like then we started realizing things. Then I think it became more personal. Like during an interview, first thing about food, which my mother said was very, it stayed with me. Like she said that people consider this food, like local food, foraging and all, as a famine food. But then I would say it is a food that will protect us from famine. I think this thing stayed with me like throughout. It's till now also. Like whenever I think about it, it gives me goosebumps. So I think food, to talk about what food refuse to forget is all the memories that comes with it, like both of the fellows have spoken about. Like when you eat a certain food, you will the people will say that it reminds them of someone who they have lost, or even the things that they used to do before we used to eat this food. So that's how people relate that, and how it is changing also, like ecologically also. If you talk about like before, there were so many languages that people used to cultivate and eat those food, prepare food from those crops, and then they used to consume it on a daily basis and share those recipes and all from their grandparents and their parents. But now, if you see that people have stopped cultivating that, and that's how it is also like being forgotten. I think for personally, like my biggest surprise was like I grew up in Zongo, and I used to think that I know a lot about food and the food culture of my people. And now I realized, I think through this project, I realized that I have taken this for granted. So when I returned back to my own community, my place as a researcher, uh, it like only to discover that my own home was a living archive, I must say, because my mother, she used to cook food. We used to just eat however she used to give us, and we never thought about asking how she learned that. Why are we eating this? Like seasonally, she would bring forage mushrooms or green, like leafy greens and all. But then we never thought of asking that question, like why and how are we, like which plants are, like what is the name of the certain plants. If we go and ask people now, they'll forget. They have forgotten like the name of plants also, and even the language of certain dishes. Like if you call this dish a certain name, that is also being forgotten with this like gradually declining of the uses of the certain plants and like something like that. So I think the more I listen to the people, the more I began to understand the ecological knowledge and wisdom that our people have, which we tend to take for granted. And when a name disappears, we lose way of seeing and understanding the landscape also, I feel, right? So for me, food refuse to forget far more than just a taste of that certain food. I think it also remembers our women's or anyone who for it, whose labors goes like often on like unseen, no? The effort that they put, the love that they put, the care that they put.
Yeah.
We considered it as just a routine, like Jigdol said. We consider it just like a routine, like how our mother cooks us food daily. It remembers our forest, which has sustained us for generation and even maybe beyond if we care for that. And it remembers our language, our recipe, our rituals. Like in Lepcha rituals, we use lots of plants, edible plants, and even food crops during our rituals. If we stop that, I think it will also forget. We will also forget all those things. So this kind of relationship with land
Mm.
also, like food also refers to forget that. And perhaps I think most important thing that this project has personally taught me is like sometimes preserving culture doesn't begin with something very big. It can happen with something small like this. Something sometimes it begins with just sitting with elder people, listen to their stories and writing them. If we are talking about food, we can write recipes also so that it is being remembered. Even the name of certain plants or crops that they used to eat, that's how we can do that also. And because when we, I think, lose these stories, I think we just don't lose our food, right? Our recipes, but also I think we lose a little piece of ourselves also, our identity also. So yeah, I think that's from my side for this section.
Thank you, all of you. I mean, I love how differently you, approach the question. I mean, listening to you all, obviously, we came to understand and it in a way like I felt our title answered itself, like what food refuses to forget. Obviously, it's the most common thread that came out of your conversation and your answer is that the relationship, the trust that you built with people, um, your relationship with your land, your culture. Even in my case, being a Tibetan living in exile, what food refuses is the history of my ancestors, my mother being a nomad and have been like displaced from that place. Whatever I eat, whether it's as simple as samba or a plate of momo or a thukpa, it always make me remember what my ancestor went through, and how we are surviving in exile because through their struggle. And that's how I think that's how beautiful food is, even though the recipes and all are interesting, the taste and whatever this thing, it's interesting. But I think in fact what's more interesting is that food can be a very interesting language to look at all the deeper level of social issues, or like to even to learn about a community for that matter. And that's how you use food as a language, all three of you, and you use it as a thread to in fact stitch all the stories together beautifully. Thank you so much. I coming to Pema. So I'd like to begin with you because I think when I read your paper, there was this idea that sat with me. It was so beautiful, which is like a local Lepcha tradition called Chongset. So more than a culinary practice, I think you have mentioned how it's a way of thinking, how women care for tomorrow. It's not just about feeding a family today, but how you're going to sustain in a long period of time. So you talk about the conservation, the idea, ecological knowledge that women of your community sort of have in sustaining and in building that relation with your land. and also obviously the knowledge behind conservation and how these are practiced and how these are in fact gradually losing if the younger generation doesn't take it up. So how did while documenting it change your way of understanding women's role? I know you have already mentioned a little bit about it already, but just to you know reflect on that part, if you can just yeah.
Yeah. So about this, like I remember sitting with a group of women. We were just talking, like we were having discussion about food, what they eat, or what they used to eat, how are the food prepared and all, and how they manage food in different difficult situations like COVID-19 and even war per se, like how it has impacted and all. And suddenly, one woman mentioned that if a man cooks, uh, they'll finish the entire week of ration in one go. Everyone like burst out laughing, and even I laughed because yes, it is kind of true in our like society or not. I wouldn't generalize it, but then it is kind of true. But then the conversation continued, and I think I realized that behind that joke was something much deeper. When I like later went home and then I just thought about it, the women were talking about the Chongset practice that we have in the Lepcha community, and I think others also they have. So for them, it wasn't just simply about managing household. It was like Choedon mentioned, like it was about thinking way ahead. So they knew how much to cook for today because they were already thinking about like evening or tomorrow also. They knew like which seed that they want to save to sow it for next season. They knew what could be harvested from forest or even for food from forest and what to leave behind also. So all this was existing. And then one woman said something that also stayed with me. Like she explained that when they go to forest and forage greens, no, they would
Mm.
not simply like uproot the entire plant uh, because they would only take what it is needed and leave behind for future,
Yeah.
or they will grow again and we will harvest it again. So they have that kind of a concept. So to me, this small practice says so much, you know. Like they understood that if you destroy the plant today, you may not have nothing to harvest or for
Mm.
us tomorrow. Nobody called it sustainability. Nobody called it as an like defined it as a conservation also, but they were practicing it. They were thinking about forest in the same way they thought about their household, like with care, resistance, and even responsibility. How to like be mindful of what to pick, what to like save for them later, and also like I began to realize this chong set was much more bigger than just managing food. It was way of living with the land, and it was also knowing when to take, when to leave, and what to save and what to protect for future, right? So
Yeah.
today we use words like sustainability, conservation, and resilience, but sitting
Absolutely.
there with those women, I think I realized that this idea were already present in every day of their life. And perhaps I think that is one of the most powerful thing that this project taught me, like something
Mm.
ecological knowledge. Like I think sometimes ecological knowledge does not exist in book or policy
Mhm.
papers or something like that. Sometimes it is just held in the hands of women who knows exactly how much to take and what to leave behind. I think that's the beauty of what like Chung said system taught me also, and I
Mhm.
hope I'll be able to do that for others also. Yeah.
Thank you, Pema. I think, when you were talking about this entire concept of Chongsit, it also, in a way, expands our understanding of care, care and labor. Because whenever we think about care when it comes to food, we only think about who cooks and then who serve it on the table. But this concept reminds us that care is something that has started much earlier before cooking, whether it's foraging practices, whether thinking about future while you're, using any kind of seeds, whatever suits for next season, how do we preserve them? All these are very, in fact, very interesting knowledge that perhaps you have already mentioned about not being out in the air. Like we today are, in the modern concept, we're talking about sustainability, but this is something that indigenous people have knowledge way before the entire concept was in discussion. So thank you so much. I think that it's such an important reminder, because we often dismiss it as like ordinary, domestic work. In fact, it's a remarkable body of ecological knowledge. I think, and I think you're doing a commendable job of preserving that in the form of archive. And that brings me to Jigdol, his work, because you're documenting Momo by listening to stories of different women vendors in Gelshing. Um, if you look at outside the Himalaya, from outside the region, Momo have become like most commercialized fast food, I would say. And but your research asks us to look beyond just that particular plate of Momo and what is the feeling inside. Not just that, you have also spent running those eateries with women in Gelshing, and you have documented their everyday work, and you have also talked a little bit about their everyday routine and how they communicate with their local customers and all. What did it actually reveal about their labor, that are often overlooked? Can you explain it a little more in detail, since you have already mentioned a bit about women's labor beyond this? But yeah, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Like, so I think coming back to like what Pema said, management is a word that I would also use, because I think I already said this key, the work at the eatery and the work in their households or in their personal lives, they are not separate, right? It's like one continuous stretch. It's like a cloth that has no seam in between. And also, there is no respite in between. Like they don't have time for leisure because of all the work that they're doing. And when I say management, it is not just like management of the household and the eatery, but also management beyond that. Because we are already talking about relationships as well. So there's also this idea of managing relationships when you're already busy with your personal work and the
Mhm.
work at the eatery as well. So as I was working with the women, because a lot of these women have been my neighbors for the past 4 5 years, and so I think have a rapport with them. So I had the blessed opportunity to be with them and work with them. I think that is the most important part here. But then what happened was they had to manage all of that. Like there might have been, let's say, a marriage somewhere in their vicinity, or they might have some kind of tragedy that might have happened in the neighborhood, and then they would have to close up their shops and they would have to go and help there as well. And I think when we look at or when we talk about management, and when we talk about, of course, what goes into making momo,
Mhm.
oftentimes, as I've already said, we only look at the storefront. We only look at what is on the menu. We only look at the cooking part of it. And that is, I think, something that you have put in rightly as well, because it is not just what shows up at the table at the end. It's not just food that sustains the making of Momo or Momo itself, but it is
Mhm.
all the work that they have done for the community, for their relationships, for their care. And it is also important because I think a lot of that care and reciprocity is also given back to them. Because sometimes they might also be ill, or they might have some kind of problems due to which they might not be able to run their eatery. And at that time, what happens is that people in their circle, their siblings, their uncles and aunts, or their cousins might come and help them. Of course, I'm not going to give much example in this because I think I will keep that for the book. You'll have to.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But yes, there have been a lot of examples wherein that
Mm.
care and that management of relationships and them going far and beyond their own capability and their responsibilities and their dependability, has
Mhm.
given rise to situations wherein they can also be helped by other people. Like they can also be cared, and their uh, the responsibility towards others can also be given back to them. And I think that is what is hidden, because of course labor, we always talk about labor, but what kind of labor? It is not just the labor that we see at the storefront and at the table, but also it is a net of dependencies, a net of responsibilities, caregiving that goes into all of it. And like that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think, Jigdol, when you were talking about what all goes beyond just before serving a plate of momo, you beautifully brought out the sense of community belongingness. And it's not just looked at as only commercial space, where people just pay money and eat and live. In fact, you brought about the community when these women are sick, how how their bond sort of, so I think in a way it's food naturally bring people together, right? And momo is one food that actually makes people who usually don't have habit of cooking come together and at least be part of at least a small process of like washing dishes or whatever it is. So yeah, I think even as a Tibetan, in Delhi, Majnuga Tila is a very popular eatery hub by now, and people just go there to eat momo. But a lot of time people don't know what story behind, like how this entire market space came into being. People never question like from where did these people, strange looking face people, came suddenly in the northern, hub of the country. And all this story, people just does not usually notice. And I think your research and your insights from your own understanding of your research, I think it, in a way, I hope when people go back, not just for a plate of momo, it can also be another, any kind of meal. There's always story behind it, story behind how this food came to this region or this place. It could have been migrated with their ancestors. It could have been changed over a period of time because of the ecological changes. There are multiple factors to it, and I hope from this conversation, people, or after reading your essay, people will try to at least think beyond just that plate of momo and what is the feeling inside. Yeah, coming to Nomika, I think your work takes us to multiple home of people in Darjeeling, and you showed us a bit of everyday meal that the region or the mountain, I mean people in the mountain eat in your region specifically. But apart from any other like essays or any other outputs in this fellowship, what is interesting is you are trying to bring a different format here. You have chosen to illustrate and along with the narrative style that you have chosen. I want to know like the entire process of intimacy, the language of intimacy when it comes to drawing. So what did that process look like? Does it have to be like, when you see a plate of food, do you sit and observe it for a longer period of time? Or is there a part of like intimate process that goes into it? How you look at that home, how you look at surrounding people involved in that place, and the labor obviously behind that meals differently.
I'll just unblur my background. Okay. So I think illustration, it's like my way of paying attention to things more. And at first it was very, very visual. Like it was just, I'll show you. So this is the journal that I keep. And then at first, I used to just draw the plate and food on it, right? No
Mm-hmm.
notes beside it, anything like that. But then after a while, it started getting repetitive. Like every page would have the same kind of drawings, the same meals. And that was also expected because I eat the same kind of food every day. So I remember thinking, like, why would people want to see this? Like, it's so boring. Even I was like kind of tired of like looking at them. And then I used to post them online and then people liked it as well. But then later I stopped because it was getting repetitive. And then just to make it interesting, okay. And then at the time, I also had this discomfort with kitchens. And then because I noticed that men and women, they had like different expectations when it came to the kitchen, cooking, and household work, right? So when I started noticing that, I had this discomfort with kitchens. And then, like I said, my meals, my drawings were getting repetitive. So to make things interesting, I started adding notes alongside them. So, and these notes are just like reflections, my observations. So I started like seeing food beyond the plate. I started noticing the labor behind my everyday meals. And then it was usually the women who were doing the work. And then my process is, I think my process also plays an important role when because I don't usually like sit and draw while eating. I usually take photographs and then sit to draw later because I like to enjoy my food while it's still hot. And then so I think when I take photos of my food first and then sit and draw later, I think that way I can decide like what to include in my illustration. Like I don't try and make an exact copy of the photograph. I
Mm-hmm.
decide what I want to include, what to leave out, and then what feels important. So that is basically my process. And then alongside that, I also write my observations. And then that's that.
Thank you, Nomika. I think that's a very interesting um, take on how you want to document stories differently. I
Mhm.
mean, a lot of time, obviously, in written format, there are intimacy, the way people tell stories, but when it comes to visualizing it, I think illustration plays a really important role, when someone is describing a food and its recipes and looking at the pictures of it, I think it feels
Mm.
absolutely different, gives different
Yeah.
emotion to us. So thank you so much. I really liked something you said about, slowing down,
Mhm.
and observing the entire process. I think that's what all three of your projects have been doing in the last few months, asking the difficult question, listening to people's stories. And this kind of, in a way, reminded that some of the most important archives don't, usually or necessarily live in museums or official spaces like libraries. They can live in very informal spaces, say in your own surroundings. It can be in kitchen, it can be in forest, it can be in the market, or family conversation, of course, and people's memories. So, but those are also archives that disappear the fastest, if not documented right on time, which you all have been talking about. So I would like to end with one very common question for you to reflect on. As researchers, young researchers, illustrator, storyteller from the region and from your own community, what responsibility do you think you carry when you're documenting stories? And equally important is, how do you approach to it, with care, with accountability, and ways that remain meaningful for the community when you go back? And yeah, just that. Maybe Jigdol?
Right. So I think for this, I think I can come back to what Pema and then too was saying. Ki a lot of the times, the knowledge that is held or the traditional knowledge that is held is often by the women, right? And of course, she also put into words that a lot of these knowledge and a lot of these practices are being lost. So I think as a researcher and as someone who is part of the community as well, dissemination, I think, is a important part of the research that we are doing. Like for us to extract whatever knowledge that is being held by these communities, by the women, by the people, and then maybe just putting it out for publication or just having it printed out is not enough. But of course, if in any way, through any way, we can like give back the same information back to the community, I think that is something that we should be doing because, of course, a lot of these traditional knowledge is like held by like women and people who are of a certain age. So a lot of the people who are young or are just coming up might not have the same access to this knowledge. So of course, if we put out or disseminate those ideas into maybe a more modern take, then I think that would be better. Uh, there is also this, I think, problem of glamour. Like, of course, I chose Momo because Momo is quite glamorous and it's quite known. But yes, a lot of the food that is foraged, a lot of the traditional food, and a lot of the food that are considered old is not something that a lot of us would also maybe go out and eat. So I think that is this problem wherein we should not be our own communities. We are being from the community. We should not just be looking at things that are very presentable. We should also be looking beyond that. And I think I'll add one more thing. I'll let the other speak as well. The thing is, we are part of the community, and whatever food that we are talking about or researching, we already have a certain love and care for those foods and those practices. But of course, if we were to go out and research a culture or a tradition that is not our own, sometimes we might judge too quickly. We might have biases of our own before we go out in the field. And I think the problem of extraction also comes from that, since we might not hold that culture or that tradition in the same respect and same level to our cultures or the love that we have for our own culture, we might sometimes think of them as, okay, I'll just like uh, talk to them about what they do and that is going to be final. So I think there should be this respect. We should not be going into the field having biases or judging, even quietly. We have to be open-minded about what we are doing and what those cultures are doing or those traditions are following. And I think that is it. I'll let the others speak more on it. I think Pemeng then, please.
Oh yeah, I was muted. I didn't know. Yeah. So yeah, I think our first responsibility as a researcher is to listen with humility, like Jigdol mentioned, like no judgments, nothing, and also like we need to be very, very, very considerate about ethics, consent, and all that is there. Like technically, we all know that we have to follow that for sure. So during my field work, I think I learned something that most of the conversation does not like happen, real conversation, especially with women's or the local community, does not happen with very structured kind of questionnaires and so. I think it happens afterward when you start building trust with them, when you start mingling with them. That's how when the real thing starts coming out. So I think like because of that only the Chongset concept came about. So uh, that taught me something that sometimes the knowledge we are looking for appears only when we are willing to slow down. Like we all have been talking about this today, and also building a very good relationship. And I think also as a researcher or whatever we get from the community, there's a responsibility for us to give back to the community also, right? Whatever we take, we also needs to give back to the community. Like, what does the community like receive from the work that we are doing, the stories that we are collecting, and also like, will they have an access to that, and how can this work like remains useful for them in future. So I think this responsibilities is also there. Like knowledge should not be only archived. Like we are talking about archiving and all. Like Jigdol said, dissemination is very important. I think it should have life within the community also. And I think which means like creating a space where other people can also participate in that and maybe go to the forest, learn about the recipe, talking to the elders, and maybe learning about the languages also. All this like not in just archive form, but also if it's continued to be practiced, I think it will be very meaningful. For that, we need to give some platform or something like that. So I think there's a scope for uh, doing that. And I think one important thing is to acknowledge the knowledge keeper that we go to, right? We go to women, and sometimes I have seen people forgetting the name of the people and also acknowledging it in a very wrong way. Our role is to listen, document carefully, definitely acknowledging them, and also respect what can and cannot be shared. This all this comes in ethics and all, and make sure their contribution is visible. Like whatever they have contributed, it needs to be very much outside or visible. And I think women's are knowledge holder that we all know, right? And during this field work, I think my paper also ended with a quote of a woman when she said, "By listening, we might remember these important things today or tomorrow, but eventually we will forget it. So if is written down, we can always return to it." I think this is why documentation is very important, and I carry this sentence with me because for me, the responsibility of researcher is not to speak for the community, but to create a condition where people can speak for themselves, right? To listen carefully and also to acknowledge them properly and they're giving back. So if research takes knowledge from the community, it should also find a way back to the community. Also return values and recognize, give a recognition to them, and also give proper access to the community also. I think that's for me is a very important responsibility that as an individual researcher we have, and also a storyteller or whoever it is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Um, So I agree with everything that's already been said, especially about not being extractive and about giving work back to the communities we learn from, and also about approaching people and their knowledge with respect. I'd just like to add a few more things that became important to me while I was doing my project. So first, I think we have a responsibility as researchers, as storytellers, not to romanticize people, food, or communities, because it's very easy to, turn like stories into something nostalgic or beautiful and leave out the contradictions. But I think as researchers, we should try not to romanticize and then also include the contradictions. Um, Second, I think context is also a form of care because if I'm writing about Darjeeling, then I can't assume that readers already know the place. So I have a responsibility to ground them culturally as well as geographically, and so that people aren't reduced to something exotic or unfamiliar. And I also think we should be honest about what our work can and cannot do. So my essay might be based in Darjeeling, but then it also does not represent all of Darjeeling. And I may have started with people I had the easiest access to, because that's where I could build trust, right? But then Darjeeling is far larger and much more diverse than, the small people that, like the small circle of people I could speak to. And also building on, Pema's point about trust. So I think our responsibility, it doesn't end when the research is over, because if people trust us with their stories, I think those stories shouldn't disappear into work that only a handful of people will read. Okay, so I think those work, like our work, it should find ways of returning to the communities like they came from. And that's that from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you all have, in a way, addressed the most difficult question of being a researcher. How do you sort of represent the community and make them feel represented properly, instead of like being exploitative, you know? Most of the times that's what happens when on ground people just go there and listen to the stories and just, you were saying about glorifying and romanticizing the entire, thing that have in fact been like someone's everyday, um, everyday life. And I think with that, when you were talking about one very important responsibility that always, we always consciously think about whenever we do a program, even at Zubaan, like whatever knowledge that you have gathered or knowledge that you have sort of documented from the community, how do you give it back to the community? Like in the sense that it's accessible and it's not always like only accessible to certain, class or, certain categories. So it has to be made easily accessible to all. And sometimes our intention or our outcome, even if it's a book, if you take it back to a village, will everyone be able to read it or not? How do you communicate that? How do you sort of use different dissemination format to tell the community that this is how the research has ended with, and this is how I have tried to represent it. So I think it's just a beginning when you're writing AC. It's just a process, but in the process, you have to also make sure that their voices are, properly represented. And when you take it back to the community, there are various other dissemination thing you can do, not just written format, but there can be different art format also used, for our other fellowship, we have people who have created theater out of, script they have changed through feminist lens and try to retell folk stories which have gender stereotype. And this have like going to villages. I mean, the most accessible thing can be to like visually present something. So there are different art format like theater used. So these are something that we also have to consider. Like it's also, I think, being a researcher, you have to also come out of your comfort zone. Like you can't say only comfortable with writing and that's only how I'm going to tell stories. You have to also sort of take suggestion, feedback from the community you're representing. That's how ethical it can work both ways, I think. And I think this is perfect to, for us to end here the conversation today. One hope of this fellowship was to actually sort of show that food can be a way of like reading people, reading places, and listening to all of you. I think that hope has really come out alive. I hope so. Listening to this conversation, people will find more engaging, interesting way to know more about the entire Himalayan region, Eastern Himalayan region. And how do we document communities without, reducing stories? How do we write about knowledge without extracting all this you have mentioned? I think these are going to help younger generation and younger researchers who might be also interested later in applying for this fellowship now that we have launched the second edition already. But I think, honestly, this is just the beginning of the process. This conversation, I think, has just opened the entire conversation. I think there are way more interesting things we're going to do in the coming months, in terms of dissemination. We can go back to community. We can host different events, conversation, use different format to, you know, be in the discussion with community that you're trying to represent in your writing. So yeah, I just want to thank you all for being very honest and sharing your entire journey. I wish you all the best. And just for the audience who are listening to us, thank you for being a thoughtful audience. And this fellowship will actually, we have two more fellows, and they're all going to write essays and have different output format, which will be presented as a collection of essays in the form of book. And we're very happy to share that the book might be launched next year at Journeying Across the Himalaya Festival, which is annual festival of Royal Enfield. So I hope you will stay tuned and keep engaging with this work, the amazing work that our fellows are doing. And yeah, thank you, everyone. And finally, I just want to thank the team at Ananke LitFest for giving us this opportunity to begin with. And we're only going to grow and only going to, talk more about our community's food from here. Thank you so much.